Bink. And we are live.
Hello.
Welcome everyone to yet another brain swap, where we'll be talking about the question of what's going to be the next big genre in anime. That's an interesting question, I think, about this whole topic of, like anime and genres. Like what's good, what's big, what's going to be big next. So we're waiting for folks to join us in the chat room, doing our last.
Who's the 36th president?
Whoops. Sorry, guys.
Pop quiz, everybody. Pop quiz.
Pop quiz.
I wish I paid attention more in history class.
Me too.
Yep.
So what's
That's life. So sorry about that. But that means we're live, which is good.
So let's see right there.
And yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about genre and what genre means and what's coming up for genre in anime. The moe boom has started to ease, and we're starting to see some more stuff. And the question is, what's the next thing we're going to see? I think that's a very valid and interesting question. We'll see where things go. And of course, the other question part of that is, what exactly was moe? What was that whole slice of life genre? What does that mean? Where was it? Why was it there? And what will be different in the future? So we will figure that out eventually.
As soon as we stifle this dog.
Exactly. Yeah, hopefully you guys can't hear the dog too loudly.
Here's a hush puppy.
Hush, puppy.
Hush puppy. Supposedly that's how they got their names.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you throw them to the dogs to get them to be quiet.
Nice. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about genres in anime, as folks will be starting to join here in a second. So
Genre.
anime, yeah. So anime. So obviously, anime covers lots of different genres. There's anime about sci-fi and all sorts of stuff, but various periods in anime have been kind of dominated by various genres, right?
Oh, yeah.
So back in the 60s and 70s, there's lots of sports anime. The big thing in the 70s especially was sports anime.
Wow.
In the 80s, you saw a lot of science fiction, a lot of mecha in the 80s, and stuff like that. And then in the 90s, we saw a lot of science fantasy. So Tenchi Muyo, Ranma 1/2.
Science fiction versus science fantasy.
Yeah, so the things where like it's science fiction, but very, very loose. Like Tenchi, where you have people able to form energy in their bare hands and stuff like that. Or technically, there could be some kind of Doctor Who style, technology that does that, but it's very loosey goosey. Saber Marionette J, that was a big franchise back then. Even Slayers, which is definitely more fantasy. And then the 2000s saw this sort of moe slice of life genre, where it was very much set in the real world with real people, focusing on romance and relationships, right? And so Clannad and Air and even Haruhi Suzumiya is very much kind of a moe slice of life with some science fiction in it, obviously.
Yeah. Just a little
fantasy
bit
too. But yeah, a lot of shows just kind of set with more or less normal people in more or less normal situations and focusing on how they get along with each other. Again, Angel Beats is more fantasy, but still kind of focusing on people. But that's started to ease, I would say.
So moe, post moe,
right,
and something coming down the pike.
Something's coming down the pike, I think, because we're starting to see certainly more shows than that. We're seeing fewer of these moe shows that are very much focused on everyday life. When I think about the anime I've seen in the past couple of seasons, I think about Roka, I think about Classroom Crisis, other stuff like that. I think Madoka Magica kind of shows that we're starting to move away from just pure slice of life. So the question would be, what's probably we're going to have a period where we have a mishmash. That's just going to happen. So there's going to be some back and forth where there's going to be lots of different genres, and then it'll sort itself out. We probably haven't gotten there yet, but the question is, what do you think is going to be the next big genre? What's going to be more than the others?
Well, I could say what I think would be, but I'm sure I'd be wrong. I
Me
could
too,
say what I'd like to see.
What would you like to see?
Well, I really like the space stories.
Yeah.
Just anything with space is interesting. I really enjoyed Planet S and Outlaw Star and things like that. And I think it kind of inspires. You can set up scenarios that give people kind of a future vision.
Yep.
And come up with some neat ideas that people might actually go for and try and do.
Absolutely. You see Cowboy Bebop, which people really love that. Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid, view. I think we're certainly seeing more fantasy than we used to. I think the MMO based anime like
Sword Art,
Sword Art is a great example of that.
Sword Art 2.
Yeah. Is It Right to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon? That was a pretty popular one. So we're seeing more of that. We're seeing more mecha than we used to.
Yeah, it's sort of a resurgence in mecha there.
Yeah, definitely. We're not seeing many sports anime.
No,
that definitely hasn't kicked off much. I think we're getting another.
I wonder why you think
Touch
that's
again. But
do you think that's because so much live sports is now available?
Good question. Possibly. Well, so sports in anime have always been a very specific thing, right? They're about the drama of
tennis,
the sport.
Kendo,
baseball.
Swimming ones, baseball.
So it's almost not as much about the sport as it is about the spirit.
The spirit, some of the story and struggles of the characters going through it.
Yeah.
I learned about some of the sport just a little bit, but not as much as if I really wanted to learn it.
Totally. So I think that's interesting that we're not seeing as much. We have seen some like Yomushi Pedal. That was pretty big. The bike racing anime, and then the tennis one, which I'm forgetting the name of.
Is that Prince of Tennis?
No. That was a big one, but there's one.
There's one more recent,
this past year. I'm forgetting it. Like One Step More, something along those lines. I really liked it, but so you have those sorts of shows, but the question is kind of, is that going to be big? It doesn't seem to be kind of going in that direction. I'll give you my thought. I'm seeing a lot more science fiction. I am seeing a preponderance of spacey in a lot of ways. Science
Space
fiction.
Dandy.
Space Dandy, Classroom Crisis. I'm trying to think of some of the others off the top of my head.
What was the one that just came out recently? It's still in progress.
I'm blanking as well.
Now I'm blanking.
Yeah, but we're certainly seeing.
Hello.
Hey, Poke Ninja. Good to see you. So Poke Ninja in our chat room is saying that hack and slash over the top action is going to come up next with Attack on Titan being a big push. So that's an interesting topic. So I the other thing is we've seen, along with the Moe boom, we also saw the boom in shonen action series like Naruto and Bleach and One Piece. And those sort of existed in their own almost bubble of things where people were certainly watching and they were a big deal, but there were only a couple of those shows.
So are they going to close down to some degree?
Bleach certainly did.
Run their course, and some things got to fill the gap.
Right. And we're seeing, I mean, we're seeing things like My Hero Academia is the next big shonen title that they're trying to build up. That could certainly fill that gap. And I think, as Poke Ninja says, I think that is definitely going to be one of those big over-the-top action titles. It's tough with shonen because shonen has always always had a larger impact on anime than other genres, just because young boys buy more manga and watch more anime than girls or adults or what have you. So they tend to get that kind of pull that other things do. But when you look at all the anime coming out in the season, and that's where it kind of gets unfair.
Now, traditionally, that's been that way. Hasn't the gap been closing a little bit more and more for fandom now?
To some extent, yeah. And I should also point out that, big difference between Japanese and American fandom too. In American fandom, we're seeing a lot more girls watching shonen. Naruto has a huge female fan base. In Japan, it's not as equitable, if you will, as over here. It's still, those shonen shows are still being watched by more boys than girls compared to over here.
Yeah, you must get girls.
But it is, yeah, absolutely. But that gap is definitely changing. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of science fiction. I'm seeing that as a something of a push. I think part of that is thanks to the increased sort of push by companies like SpaceX. I think there is a larger excitement about space travel and space exploration than there was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think folks are starting to. Space Brothers has certainly been a successful
Space
show.
Brothers. That's the show that I was trying to remember.
There we go. So we have those out there as options. We've also got more shows like Gargantia, a decent example, where it's a mecha show, but it's more about that science fiction future and exploring that civilization than it is about giant robots going around. In fact, the giant robot in Gargantia is a very special, unusual thing within the show. Now, ABK Freeman in the chat room says, and hey, Saber, points out reincarnation seems to be the trend with light novel and video game fantasy. And certainly we're going to see more of that. Video games and light novels have always been, or for the past decade or two, been strong sources for material in anime. And that's not going to change. I don't see any reason for that to change. The other interesting question will be whether we're going to see a significant change in the ratio of sources. Whether we're going to see a lot more light novel adaptations, more video game adaptations than before.
It sort of would lead in that direction as more games are on the market and available, and seeing the successful models that are out there of coming out with a show and what does and doesn't work, and the having the CG library already to work with. It's just a matter of changing some things around. I think they'd already have a good portion of it in the bank from the game itself.
And video games have the advantage that you already have a setting and a world and characters to base off of, but you're not going to follow the plot of the video game very closely. There's just no way to do that because there's only going to be one path through. So video game adaptations tend to be pretty different. Now, I should explain. I don't mean visual novels in video games in this sense. So I'm talking more like Pokemon and those the non-story-driven games, if you will. So a visual novel is very barely a game, and so I'm talking about the more like the RPGs and things like that. They give you more flexibility, whereas the visual novels will give you a story. They're very, very story driven. Like they're entirely story driven. So and that's one of the reasons why they are so popular as choices. And that's another interesting trend. We're seeing that also in visual novels. We're seeing more visual novels like Steins Gate and Robotics Notes that are science fictional in nature. And granted, those are two from the same studio. But we're seeing more that are starting to deal with those more interesting concepts. And when those get adapted into anime, well, you get the science fiction along with them. And that's
I like having that come with it.
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit more thought going into things. It's fun for fluff anime, but having something with a little bit depth to it is exciting as well. And
visual novels also have the kind of the disadvantage that there are only so many stories you can make about 6 cute girls that the main character likes before they all start looking the same, and it's hard to get an audience.
Take the plot somewhere new that we haven't already been down that path.
And that's the big problem that novels have these days, is that there's a sameness to them that is causing, and it's not that there's no way for them to be popular. It's that they don't get the audience that they do if there's something unusual about them. So you start seeing more science fiction, more stuff like that. Trying to fix the stuff with the good old Han Solo knock.
Percussive maintenance.
Exactly. So and I think it's one of the reasons we see more science fiction, because that is a twist you can add that makes that can add something to the story.
Well, now science fiction usually takes place in a future time.
True.
Is there any trend for a time already past in the ancient or possibly historical areas?
We're not seeing as much of that. And we certainly have seen historical anime over time. But there's not that much. We've seen a lot recently of twists on historical stories. So Koihime Muso is a recent franchise based on a visual novel series, I believe, where it's all historical characters, but they're all girls. And it's kind of reworking that. And there's one's Nobunaga, the Tale of Nobunaga, I think, where they gender swapped all the characters. And it's a much more silly series, but it's a fun way of taking it. So it's not historically accurate, but it's at least set in some of those time periods.
I just had a chance to read what Fisher said, and Planet S is based more around a real style future world, not completely off the base fantasy where there's superpowers beyond belief, but a future time that could really exist, that this potentially could have happened.
Yep.
And that was one of the great appeals of that show. And it dealt with real world scenarios, real emotions, potential hazards that, these guys are glorified garbage collectors, basically collecting debris from outer space. And I mean, it's important because, you could kill somebody hitting by the stuff, but at the same time, they're getting no respect. A lot of jobs are like that in the real world. And, how do these people deal with it and their struggles? And, I do like that style of show as well as the fantasy ones, science fiction and fantasy.
Well, and one of the problems, this gets back also to the difference between anime and other kind of mediums, is that anime has traditionally been better at sort of more over the top elements. So more ridiculous, powers and people leaping. People love to leap in anime. You notice that? Everyone jumps 20 feet in anime. It's a thing. Even Miyazaki does this all the time. We're just watching Princess Mononoke. And you can just jump from there to there. Okay, I guess.
Wow. I'd break my leg.
Totally. So those more realistic science fiction stories are often a harder sell because they just don't have the same visual flair that Naruto has, where you have these crazy movements. And also, and it should be, let's give credit where credit is due. You have animators who have spent decades learning how to get that wonderful action out of some, two ninja leaping at each other or whatever. It's harder for them to draw spacesuits. And they just don't have the experience like we saw in Shirobako when they want to draw a horse. Suddenly,
whoa, we never draw horses.
So this is something
how are we going to do that?
You got to learn how to do that and the musculature and so forth.
Old school.
So you got to kind of figure that out.
The hidden talent that lies within.
Yeah. So, and it's one of the reasons why with science fiction, depending on the sci-fi, you can be a little more realistic. While still have that kind of weird visual flair. Bebop being another good example, where there's enough unusual technology and enough unusual stuff that you can actually have some of that visual flair, but there's enough of the science fiction to kind of ground it in a real way. The fight with Cowboy Andy later on, where they had this wonderful sort of kung fu / cowboy fight at the end of the episode. It's a great example of this sort of weird over-the-top action that works very well in anime, but probably wouldn't translate as well to film unless Quentin Tarantino was directing it. It requires a certain visual approach to it that just works well in anime.
Tarantino directing an anime.
Well, he did. Kill Bill.
Yeah.
There's an anime segment in that. So yeah, and Poke Ninja in the chat room points out that shows like Durarara and Origami are really taking off. That's another actually interesting element, is that what we're seeing recently is a slower burn for franchises. So it used to be, you had your 26 episodes or whatever, and kind of that was it. And you might get a sequel season, but everything rode on that season. And now we're seeing Noragami, where we get a season and then we get a break and another season. A certain Magical Index and a certain Scientific Railgun are a great example where, those shows, they were certainly popular when they came out, but it's this kind of build of the franchise over time.
I really like that model because, sometimes it takes me a while to pick up a series. And if it's already burned out by the time I've gotten to it, it's kind of sad at the end.
Yeah.
But if I know that I can pick up a series, there may be another season coming, just because you know, then I can jump on that as a fan previously without saying, oh, you know, I've got to watch every episode as soon as it comes out, otherwise I'll never know. And then, you know, which horse do you back? Which show do you want to invest that much time in to find out that they will or won't?
It also gives fans a little more flexibility where, you know, I can watch Index and maybe enjoy it and then say, you know, maybe Railgun's not for me, or vice versa. And so you can kind of enjoy different pieces of the show and different off branches of the show without having to dive into the entire thing and know all the characters.
I'm curious about something.
Yeah.
Has the vampire fad fizzled out now? Is it finally come to its end? Because there's been such a vampire fetish in culture for such a long time.
That's a good point. I have not seen a new vampire show in a little while. I think there was, I mean, there were 1 or 2 this year. But, you know, considering like Vampire Knight, Kuroshitsuji, you know, there were quite a few vampire series for a while. I agree. I think that has kind of
it's wrote its
yeah, it's kind of figured itself out. The other thing too is that anime usually took a darker approach to vampirism, where it always, you know,
Japanese vampire concept.
Well, you know, they've never really, as far as I know, they've never taken just a full-scale Twilight approach to it. Well, actually,
I'm sure there's got to be somebody out there.
Well, the minute 1 or 2 they're taken as a comedy, where it's just a straight goofy thing. There's one, I think it's called Karin-chan, where the main character actually she's a vampire, but she freaks out at the sight of blood, and she gets nosebleeds, and so she you know, she's often seen with blood dripping all over her, but it's because she saw, you know, somebody and just giant nosebleed, and so there've been stuff like that, but you don't see the Twilight style vampirism where it's more of a strange character quirk than anything else. You know, it is usually something that is at best something that the main character manages and is a decent person with. So that is kind of a little bit different.
This concept of religious fantasy.
Yeah,
there's certain elements that come in. You know, the groups of priests that are doing things, and I'm wondering, is that a slowly rising
Interesting. Trend? I don't think so, because it's always been there.
It's always been there, but
you know,
more of a slow simmer, not rising to the top, or
well, I'm thinking, you know, we had Witch Hunter Robin, we had Chrono Crusade, we had Trigun, which had that kind of. So I think we've had that kind of religious fantasy for a while now, and it's certainly out there, as you say. Now, granted, you know, Noragami could be seen. I mean, not Noragami. Gosh, what am I thinking of?
No more Twilight.
No more Twilight. Hey, I watched all the Twilight movies. Was it? Maybe it was Noragami. Yeah, Noragami is technically religious fantasy. It's just Shinto religious fantasy. So it's more about, you know, gods and stuff. So we are certainly seeing that kind of stuff. And if you count that kind of religious fantasy, again, I don't know if we're seeing a lot more now than we used to, but it's certainly out there, and people are certainly reacting to it. Now, to that point, it's also not accurate religious fantasy.
Oh no, there's always variations. You got to make a good show, and you got to have it exciting, so it doesn't.
Very rarely does anime get Catholicism right. You know, that's just the way it is. Yeah. Just as we rarely get, you know, Buddhism or Shinto right in our media. So that's one of the, you know, the issues. But
so with the more historic context, things like folk tales, say folk tales from Japan, or what was the other story, fairy tale, things that are going down a narrative retelling of famous things. Is that becoming more popular as we see
interesting
other things adapted to?
Yeah, I don't see a lot more of that than we used to.
Just sort of a niche here and there.
It's a niche. I would say. I mean, it's certainly not a huge trend.
No.
But there have been a few here and there. I was surprised to see Yamishibai. It was the past year or the year before, which is Kamishibai street theater done as anime, which was very effective. I saw one or two and it was quite creeped out. So seeing that kind of stuff is interesting.
You were creeped out?
Absolutely.
Care to share?
They're horror stories. They are about really freaky things happening, and each one, so they're it's kind of a Twilight Zone style thing, but it's very simple animation, but designed to just kind of go straight to the marrow of the horror, and only 5 minutes long. So it's very intense.
For some reason, that has a strong appeal to me. I did like Twilight Zone-ish kind of feel things.
It's on Crunchyroll, so if you guys want to check it out, it's easy to go in there.
Wow.
But yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to go back and kind of chart the progress of that and see. And World Masterpiece Theater was technically things like were like Anne of Green Gables and all of those shows that were done back in the 70s. That was certainly big, and those were technically fairy tales in a way. I mean, they were certainly sort of classic stories told. 14th Angels is pointing out in the chat room, we get a nostalgia a lot, nostalgia plays. Again, I don't know how much more of that we're seeing now than we used to, but we are seeing, I would see that as a trend. Trigun Badlands Rumble, a good example. Certainly a nostalgia play there. The Resurrection of Tenchi, some of the recent Tenchi series. I think we are seeing some
Gundam that will never end.
Yeah. Gundam the Origin. It's a great example. We're going back to actually a guy, Sean Byers online was pointing this out, that Gundam the Origin is not only going back to the 1 Year War. Plot-wise, it's also going back in an animation sense. There is a freeness to the animation that feels more like 70s style, kind of lighthearted animation, where there's more frames per second. The characters have a simplicity to them in a way, in terms of like character design visually, especially side characters, and it feels more like one of those World Masterpiece Theater shows in some scenes than Gundam traditionally does. And I think it is kind of going back to that nostalgia of a time when you could kind of throw in a shot of a tower exploding as part of the battle because it looked cool. And you didn't have to think as carefully about every single aspect and answer to as many different people as maybe you do now in a lot of these franchises. So yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia in multiple senses in Origin.
We saw Ghost in the Shell come out with
exactly
something else.
Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super.
Yeah.
There's a so yeah, that's an excellent point actually. Thanks for bringing that up. I do think we're seeing more nostalgia now than we used to, and I think that is part of this fact that Moe's kind of worked its way out. What's next? And when you don't know, it's easy to fall back on popular things in the past.
So sort of it's boiled off, and now we're left with everything else in the pot. So what about things like sort of alien invasion type of science fiction, like Parasite, where aliens come in and kind of take over a host body, and then you have this struggle of the aliens in society to figure out what they're doing and their purpose and their place, and sort of any sort of genetic mutation type of story, more of a science twist type of fantasy, like current day and time,
right?
Maybe even not flip phones, maybe iPhones or something more up to date.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that anime does very well. Gotcha Man Crowds is a good example of a show which I haven't seen much of, but it is that kind of more of a commentary on modern society than it is a realistic show or even really a superhero show. Yurikuma Arashi is kind of it is a fantasy series in that sense, but it's more about human relationships and how people treat each other in a very specific kind of social sense. But it also includes, the lesbian bear storm. So, that's the literal title of that show. So there's these weird sort of fantastical elements, but it's more about that sort of focus.
Yeah, I agree. Moe is never going to completely disappear.
No.
That's always there's a certain residual that didn't melt away. But as trends come and go, you see a lot of people jump on the bandwagon. They bring it to the front, to the forefront, to the in your face. Oh my God, please stop. Eventually it's that bubble bursts, a lot of it disappears, and then there's references, and then it sort of diminishes, and then it has its little base level that it kind of floats at for a while.
Definitely. Well, and let's point out that Moe is not a genre per se. Moe is more of an emotion you feel about a character, right? Moe is about, cute girl or boy characters who you kind of want to protect and you want to have a relationship with. So you can have Moe in all sorts of different contexts. I'm watching Macross with a friend, original Super Dimension Fortress Macross, and Minmay is absolutely a Moe character. There's just that's what she is there for. And I'm not complaining, but that is that sort of character archetype in that show. And so you see it in lots of different contexts. So, Moe is not going away, and nor will that sort of general Moe slice of life kind of concept.
Oh, here's an interesting concept. Social commentary, political commentary.
Wow, I would have to go back and look at my list. I can't think off the top of my head.
We've seen environmental commentary.
Sure.
Quite heavily.
Yes, such as?
Miyazaki's.
Yep, absolutely. And Miyazaki's oeuvre definitely focuses on environmental stuff.
And it's kind of interesting. I think you brought out that Ghost in the Shell had a basis in the political history of the Shinsengumi.
And Ghost in the Shell standalone complex is a great example of political commentary and social commentary.
And it gets really deep in there. The whole concept of refugees and how we treat each other and what's right and how to get things changed, and is it ethical to go with a more Machiavellian approach to getting your goals accomplished. And so I did really enjoy that aspect of it. A definitely more adult show in the idea, not of sexually, but subjects that little kids wouldn't have a framework to put it in, but somebody with a little bit more life experience says, oh, wait, they're saying something, they're showing situations that I kind of read in the newspaper. And how are these guys responding to it? Any good ideas?
I would say certainly Shinichiro Watanabe's most recent series, the one with the terrorists. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it. Zankyo no Terror. I think is the name of it. That's certainly about modern terrorism and the question of what constitutes terrorism. Also, oh gosh, I think you watched this. One of the boy and the girl. The boy wakes up in front of the White House.
I wanted to watch it. I didn't get all the way through it.
I saw the first episode.
That sounded
too
very exciting.
Gotcha Man crowds again. I've only seen bits and pieces, but I'm not certain.
I wish I could remember the name of that because I remember the story.
I think it's over there too somewhere, so I'll have to think about that. But and the other thing too, like we never get much political commentary because it just doesn't sell, right?
I suppose there's a risk of making that also because you think about what happened with
Eden
Rosebud.
of the East. Thank you.
Eden of the East.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
The whole Rosebud.
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane was a commentary about Hearst, and that just about
killed the movie.
Killed the movie because it was obvious who was being talked about, and so there is a big risk of doing a political commentary in something that's generally an artistic or more artistic, emotionally leaning medium, entertaining medium.
And I think anime gets away with it more than over here because I don't think politicians care about anime in Japan, other than as a general, people buy it and so it's good for the economy. But I don't see Japanese politicians calling out anime for specific, political stuff. They may call it out for violence and for things like that, or sexuality, where it goes a bit over the top.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned things being called out. There was the manga, wasn't there, that was designed during some of the law changes about.
Oh yes,
about
the Tokyo Youth Ordinance Bill Amendment.
That's
yes.
what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a commentary, social commentary,
Sure.
satire about the whole situation.
Yeah. And there's certainly a lot more social satire manga. I think that's where a lot of it comes out.
More manga side, but manga's an incubator for a lot of anime.
Yeah.
If it gets enough support.
Hitalia Access Powers, I would say, is definitely political commentary in the sense that it's making fun of stereotypical nationalities or stereotypical nation states sort of behaviors.
I haven't seen this yet. I've got to see it.
It's fun.
I have a friend who just loves it. So
yeah, it's goofy and fun. Don't take it too seriously, really. But yeah, and then there's the I'm forgetting the name. There's a manga about character named Afghanistan, and her friends Pakistan and Kazakhstan, who have little moe characters who run around and have keep getting their land kind of pushed aside by the USA, who just doesn't see why this is a big deal. She just needs to resolve a few problems, resolve the problems, and so you just go over there while we take care of these things. It's definitely very political, but something you don't see. Now, you also see some kind of religious commentary and things like Saint Young Men, which is a manga about Jesus and Buddha as roommates in modern Tokyo, which is religious commentary in the sense that it's kind of making fun of stereotypical tenets of those religions and how things are supposed to be. But it's a little more fun. But that has been controversial. Folks have been complaining about some of those things.
I would love to see some H.P. Lovecraft stuff.
Lovecraft anime. Oh, there's lots of Lovecraft references in anime.
I'm curious. The Wind Rises controversy.
Yes. So that is definitely historical commentary, if you will. So The Wind Rises is Miyazaki's movie about the man who designed the Japanese Zero, the fighter plane in World War II. And there's a lot of controversy because that plane killed a lot of people. And while being well designed, it was seen by a lot of people as lionizing the war and kind of making it seem like it's an awesome thing that people were designing these weapons of death.
Has enough time passed since then that it can be looked at with a more objective perspective?
And
as Japan and US are allies, we always have, every country has, little arguments about this and that, but we've become allies.
Yeah, exactly. And to be fair, and as far as I know, the vast majority of the controversy happened in Japan. it was Japanese people saying, "Is it cool to really talk about it?" But having seen the film makes it very clear that the Zero was this dangerous weapon of war, but the protagonist wanted to design a plane. He was a plane designer, and the military was the only contractor during the war. They were the only people who would buy a plane, so they were the only client. And he did wrestle with the fact that, well, I am designing this thing that's going to kill people, but that is what I do. That is my passion. So I'm going to build this thing, and then it kind of goes out of my hands. And so I think it's overblown in the sense that I do not think in any way that Miyazaki was glorifying the negative aspects of that.
Did it have a political angle to it, or was it more of a historical?
Well,
sort of. Well, here it is, but it brings along a lot of political baggage with it.
I think that was it. It was meant to be more of essentially a biography of Jiro, but inevitably that has political ramifications because of what goes on and because of things that happened in historically, the Great Kanto earthquake that happened before all that Jiro lived through, and seeing the devastation that occurred from that, and trying to start a family. You want to protect for your family, you want to provide for them, and the military is there and they have the money and they're the only ones with the money.
What
so that's what you do.
what other things can you? Yeah.
Right. And I think it's the power of films like that is being able to take those touchy subjects and portray them and bring them up. I mean, nobody's talking about that in that way until that movie comes out.
Does anime have a better position to do that kind of thing?
Interesting question.
There are certain aspects of anime where you're not dealing with the face of a human actor,
right?
And so it's a little bit more of separation from the situation, almost like having a puppet that can deal with something that a person can't deal with too much internally. They can separate a little bit from it and start, I guess, the dialogue process on some of these things. And of course, healing comes with being able to talk about them, because
right.
I mean, up until then, I mean, it's not like you could do a historical thing without bringing that, and it's a little bit softer when there's not.
Yeah, well, Scott McCloud talks about that in Understanding Comics, that the more you abstract things, the more our brains treat them as symbols, which you want them to treat those things as symbols. You want them to treat them as concepts to think about, as opposed to, oh, that is, Tom Hanks. You want to kind of pull back from that. Well, then, lest we forget, Barefoot Gen was very controversial when it came out, which is an adaptation of an autobiographical story about a guy who lived through Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima. And adapting that into an anime and showing that in theaters was a controversial thing, especially in Japan. And that was back in the 70s or early 80s. And so, I mean, that was a big deal to portray that as accurately as was possible in animation. And by doing it in animation, one of the reasons they did it in animation is that they could portray it. The budget that you would have needed to portray it accurately in live action just would have made it, plus, the effects just wouldn't look right. Showing somebody literally being disintegrated by that, and then seeing all the people, laying around and all of the disease and so forth. But you can do it in animation, and you feel for the characters more because they are these slightly more abstract things, which is very important.
Wow.
So yeah, that's one of the big things there.
Do you think there's going to be a trend of doing anime that tends to be more on the shocking side, more?
I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I in some of the more horror-oriented shows, action is always exciting. The hack and slash sort of idea of and blood is kind of seems to crescendo every now and then.
Yeah. I mean, certainly Akira was a sort of touchstone for that. And then Elfen Lied had a lot of that. And then more recently, High School of the Dead, combined horror with action very effectively. I mean, I still say the first 5 episodes of High School of the Dead is the most perfect zombie story I've ever seen in any medium.
Wow.
There's also a lot of just weird TNA. But and it's certainly very gruesome in that way. So I think that does kind of crescendo and come in and out over time. I can't think of any shows in the past year or two that have been like shockingly grotesque. So I wonder if that's something that's due, perhaps.
Come up sometime soon.
Yeah. So in terms of Lovecraft inspired anime, it's not so much Lovecraft Lovecraft inspired in terms of references. So Nyarlathotep, I think is the name of it. There's an anime series where all the old ones are cute moe girls living in a room together. And so that is Lovecraft inspired. You'll see a lot of Lovecraft in Digimon Tamers, surprisingly. So there's some not a lot, but there are some Lovecraft things. Chaki J. Konaka, the anime writer, likes to throw in Lovecraft references. So there are a few of those in there. There are some other, I'm trying to think of some other examples where Lovecraft is kind of thrown in there and referenced. Nothing's quite coming to mind, but I know I've seen one or two where there are at least callbacks or stuff like that. But I think that's, again, one of those things where I think a lot of the anime creators know Lovecraft, but not necessarily the audience. So they can
Cthulhu is kind of thrown in every now and then in a lot of U.S. anime and other forms. But yeah, it's taken me years before I realized what a gold mine Lovecraft is. Sort of inheriting from Poe the skills to write in ways that are just phenomenal. And my exposure to Lovecraft originally was, there's a band Metallica and they say they really liked his writings. Who is this Lovecraft? I've never seen him on my bookshelves in my bookstore. So finally, years later, I ended up getting a download of radio dramatizations of Lovecraft.
Nice.
And they were fascinating. And they actually scared me. I mean, they really, a lot of horror just seems kind of campy to me, but these things made me think, and I could visualize what they were talking about as I was listening to them. And it took me to places that really creeped me out. So I would really, anytime I see a reference to it, having consumed some of his stories, I can pick out bits and pieces. And it's just fascinating when you see it come about. But having one that would be an adaptation, that would be interesting to see.
It really would. I think anime could handle it quite well.
It would be an ideal environment for bringing that in.
Indeed, I think Attack on Titan is rather Lovecraft-esque. I don't know that it was inspired by Lovecraft, but it does have that sense of creeping horror, that kind of inescapable giant things that are going to destroy you, and you can fight it, maybe you can never get away from it entirely. That's certainly that sort of ever-present dread that Lovecraft does so well. So yeah, it's a tough, and then of course references to the Necronomicon. And that's Lovecraft through and through. I've been watching, it's a quick side, I've been watching Ash vs. the Evil Dead. And it's just great fun. It's a great example of just taking some of those elements and kind of throwing it into your story to have fun with. That's a really, really fun show.
On a lighter note, are we going to see any more music-based anime like K-On! Or Beck? Well,
I think certainly
Pop Idols.
We're seeing a lot of Pop Idol shows, definitely. We saw several Idol Masters. We've seen Love Live, a couple of Love Lives now, other things like that. I think that's certainly a big trend. The big question there, and I think we're going to see more of that because there are so many Japanese video games based around the concept. The rhythm games, there are tons of rhythm games out there. So there's plenty of material to mine. And that gets so perfectly into the anime media mix of having a video game and an anime and a manga and a novel series and all these various things. They can really support each other very well in the marketplace. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of that in future. I'm actually waiting to see some interesting variations in the musical genre. I would love to see some of these, Pop Idol, here are 8 girls all trying to be pop idols, like done as science fiction, or done with a fantasy twist. I think it's kind of time to.
She's not a pop idol. She's a time-traveling Esper.
Well, and obviously, Macross famously has a very musical.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So, and we've got Macross Delta coming out, so that'll add some of that. So that's an interesting question. Is we'll see some variations on that pretty soon.
But it probably won't develop as a full genre that would compete with the other genres. It would be more of a sub-level genre.
Yeah. And Liquidus, you're right. There are, getting back to that kind of nostalgia element, Kill la Kill is a show that is very nostalgic. It is calling back to those over the top student council, ridiculous school stories of the 70s.
Kill la Kill had an interesting focus on clothing that I think, as a cosplayer, it has been neglected in so many stories. That you see some uniforms and some change, but this really focused the whole outfit idea a little bit more, and of course, some of the silliness of outfits that are very skimpy. How can you fight in that?
Yeah.
You can't come to school with that.
How
It's
can you wear
indecent.
that? Yeah.
So it's kind of looking back on itself, anime looking back at itself, and reflecting on some of the some of the other areas.
And Studio Trigger does that a lot. I mean, what was it? Yeah,
Cthulhu is not Moe. No,
it isn't this show. Little Witch Academia. Little Witch. It was Little Witch Academia, wasn't it? No, I'm thinking My Hero Academia. The Little Witch show that Studio Trigger did. That was very much, having fun with the magical girl trope and kind of the Harry Potter trope, and playing around with that whole idea. There's not a lot new in it, but it's having a lot of fun with the idea of mentors and having magical powers and having to deal with that as a young character. Heck, the whole scene with the brooms for the first time felt like it was pulled right out of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone for you international folks. The nostalgia is certainly a big push out there. I don't know. Like I said, I'm seeing more science fiction. I think science fiction is starting to certainly get more of a handhold than it did in the past, in the past decade or so. But we're also seeing a lot of nostalgia.
So is the science fiction going to now most anime being created in Japan and having a smaller female following for science fiction, are we going to see more female viewer inclusive style science fiction?
Interesting.
As here in the States, there's a huge fandom for science fiction among women, and I mean it's not as big as guys, of course, but a lot more have become, especially with Doctor Who. And, everybody's Tennant. A lot of girls.
Matt Smith too. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is there going to be anything gearing more in an inclusive?
It's an interesting question. The one big science fictional magical girl franchise I can think of was Nanoha, magical girl lyrical Nanoha, which had sort of science fictional powers and so forth. But that was aimed more at guys. That got a larger guy audience. So I don't know. I think it would be a great thing to see more science fiction with that female audience in mind. Getting back to Macross, another good example of a show where they included a lot of relational stuff. They made it somewhat less about just constant violence and action, and pushed it more towards relationships and stories and real people interacting with each other, not just romance, although that was there too. And that got a big female audience.
Having a well-rounded collection of different things.
Anime has the advantage that it's had strong female characters for a very long time. So it can represent female characters that the audience is willing to tune in to watch.
I sympathize, or
I want to be like them, or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. Stargate anime, that would be awesome.
There was a Stargate animation, and I watched it after binge watching the entire franchise of Stargate, and having gone from Stargate through the entire series, then Stargate Atlantis, and then Stargate Universe.
Wow.
I then went to the animation, and the franchise got more serious as it changed from portion to portion. Universe was very dark. I mean, they had sections where there was no solution, and they end the episode not wrapping everything up in a perfect everything solved bow. And I really like that because it's gritty. It's you're not going to get the Hollywood satisfaction and everything's peachy at the end. But then when I went to the cartoon, it was a cartoon. It wasn't an anime. It was hard to watch. I mean, I'm pretty tolerant of watching a lot of things, but having built up that knowledge base of all the other episodes, I couldn't watch it. If I go back now, I might be able to, but I'd like to see some Stargate anime that would be watchable.
Yeah.
Maybe geared towards a more mature audience might help.
and Stargate would be a great property for that. You know, I think
they could mine that.
Yeah, and it's a very anime-like property. It's a little over the top. It's a little, in terms of the technology, it has that kind of science fantasy element where it doesn't have to be rigorously scientific, but you know, there's a sense of how everything works. Everything has a logic behind it. Again, like Tenchi. So I really like that idea. I think that would be really a lot of fun. I'd like to see a Doctor Who anime, personally.
A Doctor Who anime? Yeah. Has there been any animations with
There
Doctor
certainly
Who?
has. There have been sort of web episodes, things like that. No full like animated series. There is an animator online who did a fantastic couple-minute long like full animated fan animation of Doctor Who in the anime style, and I highly recommend you look it up. It's a lot of fun. It stars, I believe, the third Doctor, which is like the third classic Doctor, which is a very interesting choice. We'll see. Yeah.
Thank you for appreciating our set.
Yeah, exactly. And Liquidus is right that, you know, over here in the US, we're still going crazy for superheroes. I just got back from watching Star Wars: The Force Awakens, and I got 2 Marvel movies on the front as previews. So they were pushing Marvel very hard, and obviously Jessica Jones and the other TV shows. So Liquidus asks, what's the current film craze in Japan that might influence the popular anime genre of today, like Marvel is influencing television? That's a very good question. I don't know. I'm not aware of there being any big film craze in Japan right now. There may be.
Who knows after Star Wars?
And I mean, Japan has a relatively small original film, market. So there's not a huge number of Japanese films being made every year, because they fill in with, you know, American films and Korean films, lots of other things. There's more, you know, cross-cultural stuff than we get over here. You know, getting a foreign film in a multiplex over here is a tough thing. Over there, it's easy. So it's a good question. And again, I think it gets back to where anime is borrowing much more from manga than it is from films. I think they're really paying attention more to what's selling in manga. But so now you're in my scope 2. That's you're in my scope, not the other thing. Points out that the Game of Thrones model is a lot of fun, where introducing a lot of characters, a lot of relationships, and then killing them off one by one is can be a very entertaining model, because you can bring in characters and like kind of get to know them, but then you never know who's gonna live. I'm trying to think of anime that does that a lot, where you get a lot of characters getting killed off one by one. Attack on Titan.
Kami ga Kill.
Oh, true.
They
yes.
Kind of. I remember somebody complaining on the forum post before I even saw it. You want to have your favorite characters killed off. This is the one for you. As soon as you love them, they'll die.
Yeah. Gundam does that a lot. So there's a lot of character death in Gundam. Macross generally will have one major death per series. So they don't kill off a lot of characters, but they'll kill 1 or 2 off and really shock you with it. Macross Frontier did that very well. I won't tell you who.
No spoilers.
No spoilers, but there is a surprising death there. There is also, and I don't think it's the spoiler, they build up to a death and then reverse it. So they kind of, so Macross Frontier is it was the 25th anniversary, I think, Macross series. So lots of references and callbacks to previous Macross series, having a lot of fun with tropes and elements and bringing things in. And then they start to mirror a character's death from another Macross series and have the same stuff happening and build up to it. And then they reverse it at the end.
Twist.
It was a really, really fun little thing. Oh
like
my
a
God.
twist.
They even have 2 characters afterwards turn to each other and go, man, it would be really tragic if he'd actually died. I mean, that would have been such a dramatic moment. But yeah, so I agree. I think those longer, and again, I think Gundam does do that, where they set up those relationships, those attachments, and then kills them off one by one. Zeta Gundam famously does that a lot, where they basically they establish an antagonist and then start killing off everyone around him one by one to show you why he is so driven against the protagonist. It really establishes his reason for doing things because he loses so many people, which I think is a very effective way of doing it. And like what it says, superhero comics do kill off characters on and off, but then they always come back. So unless they're girlfriends, and then they just get fridged, which is always annoying.
Now I'm thinking of Stargate. That doctor was hot. She should have had her name in the main credits. She was awesome.
Yeah.
I saw her in some other show at some point too, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yes, Master Chief Snake. I've seen the first episode of Iron Blooded Orphans. I've not seen any more, but I want to. I liked what I saw. It's a very dark, sort of serious Gundam so far, but I've been trying to get through other stuff, so I've been kind of saving Iron Blooded Orphans for when I have time to really devote to it and pay close attention.
Yeah, sometimes I'll have something going on in the background, and I feel terrible because I want to watch it with intensity and focus and absorb everything. And if I'm cooking dinner and I've got it in the background, I'm like, I know I watched it, but I don't really remember any. Yeah, I know something happened, but
yeah, I can't do that. I've got to have it front and center.
Yeah,
focusing on it. So that's just my
so
brain.
Much anime though.
I know.
So little time to do it. I'm like, I want to get it in more.
Yeah, but my view is I'm not getting it in at that point. It's like, well, it ran and it was playing, but I didn't really watch it, so that's tough. So yes, and so you're right, Master Chief Snake, that Tomino, he was actually known as Kill 'Em All Tomino before Ideon. I believe it was back with his 1978 series Zambot 3, where he first became known as Kill 'Em All Tomino. I could be wrong on that, but that was certainly one where he killed off characters right and left in Zambot 3. I mean, there are very few human beings left alive at the end of that TV show. There's so much death. And he tends to kind of move back and forth. But he'll kill off a lot of characters, then in the next series he'll do fewer, and then he'll do more. And in some of the shows it kind of makes sense, and others it's like we're just killing people just cause it's fun. Victory Gundam famously being one. If you got and Ideon, I should point out, Ideon is a series that was very influential for Evangelion. It's a big inspiration for Evangelion. And it is dark, and especially in the movies, there is a lot of on-screen death of characters, and some of them are very brutal and dark. And just be aware, there are certain character deaths that are burned into my memory, and I'm not sure that I'm glad I saw it.
I lean towards the kind of the darker stories, and that sounds intriguing. So just some of the description that I see on there.
It's an interesting show. Ideon was considered, Hideaki Anno purportedly considered Ideon to be Tomino's masterpiece when it came out.
So now this is Densetsu
Kyojin
Ideon.
Yes.
And so that was 1980 to 1981.
It was the show that came out right after the first Mobile Suit Gundam series, and which came out right after Zambot 3. Yeah, it was a big deal. Ideon was kind of the after Gundam had proven that they could do serious giant robot series, the more serious mecha, Ideon was pushing that as far as they could in terms of telling a dark story.
Now, I understand there were 43 episodes that were supposed to be produced, but they pulled the plug after 39. Was that because of some of the storytelling or money, or
I believe it was more money. But I mean, a lot of Tomino's shows got pulled. I think it was money, and it was also just people weren't watching it, and his shows were not as popular back then.
But to have such an influence on Neon Genesis,
yeah. Well, they also did 2 movies after the TV show, and the first is basically a retelling of the TV show, or most of the the first 2/3, 3/4 of the TV show, and the second is a new ending, where everyone dies. I'm kind of anyway. Yeah, there are. It's dark.
Stefan.
Yeah. Hey, Stefan. Glad to see you. So yeah, that is that's yeah. So I think that is basically our thoughts on
sci-fi.
I think we're going to see more sci-fi. We're definitely going to continue to see more of these pop idol shows, and nostalgia is certainly a thing. Nostalgia is a popular thing right now, because why not, right?
There's nothing new under the sun, and it's funny to think of as I think Liquid Snake
Mm.
was mentioning the 7 basic plot plot lines that exist in narrative, and how everything is a variation on those themes, some emphasizing one component more over another. And it should be interesting to see which directions they twist and turn the stories coming up.
And for what it's worth, I mean, you know, those are useful things to think about, but there's only so far you can take that. I challenge you to take those plot lines and put one on top of My Neighbor Totoro. You know, that doesn't really fit into any of the classic plots.
Characteristics, but not cookie cutter.
Right.
That's what makes some of these things so exciting, is it's a completely different viewing of that those concepts.
Exactly. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, I think that'll do it for us for this week. Thank you all very much for joining us. Next week we're going to be talking. Next week is Christmas. We're going to be broadcasting live on Christmas, because why not?
Christmas.
You know, we're otaku.
Yeah.
We keep talking about this stuff. We're going to talk about a question brought up in the chat room. Is anime going to move to CGI?
CGI.
Are we going to see computer graphics take over from hand-drawn animation in anime anytime soon? Is that already happening? And what are the chances of it kind of taking over? And why or why hasn't it happened yet? Considering how
good question,
America has really done it. What's going on there? So we'll talk about that next week. We're going to stay off run in the chat room for a little bit after the stream ends. So hang out in the chat room for a little bit. And if you want to see more videos like that, please head over to geekarchaeologists.com for more of this kind of stuff, and interviews and reviews and all the fun stuff.
Yeah. And I did mention this in a forum on my Otaku. So if you want to continue discussing these things further, there's a spot there where you can hop in and add your commentary if the chat room here has concluded.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all very much. We will see you all next week. Until next time, we've swapped brains.
Thanks for joining us.